now you have the privileges, that would be great too. Fantastic. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Sorry for the delay, all kinds of technology issues as usual, as if we couldn't sort them out in the last couple of years. So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Book of the Semester panel. But before we actually start our discussion, I'd like to introduce our today's panelists. We have Jason Callender, who is the Associate Director of the Jackson Center of the Mississippi State University School of Architecture. His research is largely about the relationship between making and perceiving architectures and the success of cities where that architecture happens. In the 90s and 2000s, he worked on several award-winning projects in the American South. He's a member of the Society of Architectural Historians, U.S. Green Building Council, and a board member of the Mississippi chapter of the American Institute of Architects. His research interests come from his educational background in both architecture and philosophy, as well as art. And his book, Architecture, History, and Theory in Reverse, just came out in 2017, and his next book is coming out this December and is going to be dedicated to building successful cities. Our second panelist, Jacob Moore, is the Associate Director of the Temple Hoyne-Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Prior to joining Buell Center, Moore worked as an editor at Princeton Architectural Press. He received his BA in Architecture and a Master of Science in Critical, Curatorial, and Conceptual Practices in Architecture from Columbia University. His work has been exhibited internationally and published in various magazines and journals, including Art Forum, Future, Interior, and the Every Review. These days, he is working on a project called Unbroken Windows about urban policing, and hopefully he's going to mention it in our conversation today. Our third panelist, Corey Gallo, holds a Bachelor of Landscape Architecture from Louisiana State University and a Master's of Urban Design from the University of Michigan. Corey is a licensed landscape architect and has worked professionally in the Pacific Northwest, Midwest, and the South. He's a professor of landscape architecture here at Mississippi State University and teaches courses in community design, stormwater design, green infrastructure planning, watershed management, and professional practice. His research interests are focused on sustainable design in urban landscapes. And I'm going to moderate this panel. My name is Kate Malla. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Architecture here at Mississippi State. Now, one more thing before we get to our actual conversation. I need to thank our libraries here at MSU for the media support, as well as the Institute for the Humanities for the media support and live streaming our event to Facebook. The book that we are going to discuss today, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, was written by the journalist, writer, organizer, and theorist Jane Jacobs. Jacobs lived and worked in New York City at the time of the mid-20th century urban renewal, a massive redevelopment program that led to the destruction of many older traditional urban neighborhoods and an introduction of largely car-centric residential tower landscapes in their place. Jacobs famously organized a successful campaign against such redevelopment of her New York home neighborhood, Greenwich Village, and with her consequent book, forced architects and planners everywhere in the country and even globally to reconsider their theoretic platform and practices. The Death and Life came out in 1961, exactly 60 years ago, and although not all of its principles immediately took over architectural and planning thinking, these days we clearly live in cities that are directly affected by Jacobs' thinking. Architects frequently call her Saint Jane, which you may have heard before. So this drives my first question to our panelists. What do you think about Jane Jacobs' role in shaping current-day American urban built environments?
I'm happy to go first if the other speakers are okay with that. Um, um, I think it's important to understand the role of this book today in terms of how active or how how relevant it is to today's circumstances. And there's a quote on the poster, and I don't remember it exactly, but it basically said, if we have imbibed all the lessons of Jane Jacobs, we can still read her as great literature about streets. And I actually think that's kind of a dangerous interpretation because it underestimates the importance of the message for people today. And if you allow me just a quick analogy, in 1969, there was a massive hurricane in the Gulf Coast, near the Gulf Coast. And so 1969, there's no cable news, there's no internet. The people along the Mississippi Gulf Coast were trying to figure out where this storm was going by watching their black and white televisions hooked to an antenna. And their source of information was a handful of television stations, mostly in New Orleans. And the New Orleans broadcasters went on TV and said, you know, it looks like we're out of the woods. We are going to be safe. It's not, Hurricane Camille's not going to hit us. It's going to go east of us. And a lot of people sitting on the Gulf Coast, a lot of the residents there thought, great, because they interpreted we and us to mean everybody in the broadcast area. And what the people in New Orleans on TV meant was we and us meant people in New Orleans. And of course, the storm came ashore east of New Orleans and flattened the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and 143 people along the coast died. I tell that story because I think it mirrors what's going on in sort of recent discussions about urban planning and architecture. Um, in the last 20 years, I've been interested in cities and how city form relates to sustainability. And in academic press and in popular press, there have been numerous essays and articles of people saying density is overrated. We talk too much about density. Density doesn't matter. Or it does matter, but it doesn't matter any more than saying put green roofs on buildings. That doesn't make sense to me. I live in a city with 1,400 people per square mile, and we can't fix any of the city's problems without addressing density. So I started to wonder, where's this information coming from? And I got to a place for about 10 years where every time I saw one of those articles, I would do a 5-minute Google search on who the person is, where are they from, where do they live, where do they go to school. And the places that came up over and over, it was New York and Chicago, San Francisco, Toronto, Mexico City, and London. And guess what? They're right. When they say we don't need more density won't help us, they're more or less right. Density reaches a point where it is, it reaches a critical mass where more won't help. The problem is the vast majority of us live in a world that it doesn't have near that density. The vast majority of people in the world live in places like Jackson, Mississippi, without density. And what is going to happen if, and I have a lot of friends in urban planning and architecture who have bought into those arguments that density is sort of overrated. And what it eventually will do is it will kill people. So that for me is the importance of density. And the reason I mentioned in relation to Jane Jacobs in this book is one profitable way to read The Death and Life of Great American Cities is as a 450-page plea for density. And it's 22 chapters on 22 different ways that you can do density poorly and you can do density well. So for me, it is, this book is sort of the center of the world, and it should be seen as relevant today.
I'm happy to try to follow the density discussion from Jason. Um, I'm also thank you first of all for allowing me to be here. This book was hugely influential in especially my early career, and being asked to be here today is almost like revisiting my college years in a way, with that initial discovery of Jane Jacobs and influencing the way that I think about urban form. And I think the biggest influence it's had in shaping our current day it's really about, in my mind, a little bit different than the way Jason's discussing it, but you have to read Jane Jacobs in context of when it was written. I agree, and also in response to what she was writing to, and then what came before that. So in many ways, Jane Jacobs in this book was a investigation on utopian visions that would come out of a response to the 19th century, and then these sort of ideas being laid out in urban form in the early 1900s or 20th century, and then a response to, wait a minute, this isn't exactly working for people. And I think the most important thing she taught us through that is how to look at cities, how to observe cities, how to see how things work. And also, I think it taught us a great deal of humility in that process. Robert Fishman wrote a great book on urban utopias of the 20th century, where he sort of outlines these visionary ideas of utopian cities by Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright, Ebenezer Howard, and these ideas of what utopias could be based on this capitalist-driven, environmentally detrimental, 19th century cities that were ruled, very dirty cities that are polluted, that were very segregated. And so, at the same time, he ends with this discussion of Jane Jacobs sort of proved them all wrong in a way of, it's sort of the 20th century proved them all wrong. And I think she was like this really meek person at a time, raising her hand, going, or not meek, but she didn't come from the design world, so she sort of raised her hand and said, "I know you guys," and it was all guys, right, at the time. "You guys have it figured out, but you don't. You don't have it figured out, and we have to look and observe how these intricate social networks work." And the part that in the book that, and it leads to Christopher Alexander and these urban theorists that more directly in these sort of small scale interventions, and then stepping back and see what happens. And then another small step versus these bold visions of art, cities as art, as she describes them, that are not necessarily art, but I think she described them as dead corpses at the end of the day because they have no life. So anyway, that's what I take away is how the role in shaping is teaching an entire generation of designers to look first at what exists in how things work.
I'm happy to jump in on the density question. Maybe thanks for inviting me. Maybe I should also start by saying that my main association with Jacobs prior to, she's come in and out of my grad school education and then my professional life in certain moments, but my main association is in college as well. So it's a nice opportunity to sort of revisit some of those early lessons. But also I wouldn't want to claim to be some kind of Jacobs expert per se, but I've been in New York for, I don't know, 20 years now, something like that. And I grew up in the suburbs in Tennessee. And both of those experiences also shape how I think about Jacobs, but more specifically, since you all kicked it off on the question of density, about density. And I think for me, so my perspective today is about the context in which Jacobs was writing, but also the context in which her work speaks today. And as Kate mentioned, we've been working on a project here at the Buell Center that we're calling Unbroken Windows, that's about the cultures of surveillance and policing in urban areas primarily today, but again, a wide variety of urban areas. And maybe we'll have more opportunities to talk about it in detail, but just on the question of density, I think for me, what Jacobs has, a discourse she helped build momentum around is one where I absolutely agree that She brought attention to density at a time when it was necessary, and certainly now more than ever. I mean, I don't know many people here in New York who fit into the characteristics. I feel like everybody I know is still very pro pro density here, but I would say that I think Jacobs was part of a conversation then that very much persists to today. That there's like good density and bad density, and we can talk about how you might slice and dice that, but from the perspective of broken windows and what I'll probably focus on today as we keep talking is that unfortunately at the time in the 60s she was writing in response to as was mentioned urban renewal and some really awful clearing of long-standing neighborhoods in cities all across the United States, not just New York, and their replacement with largely housing developments that in many cases in New York especially, but elsewhere were public housing developments, you know, towers in the park kind of thing. And we can certainly talk about the relative merits of those designs, but I'll just maybe just as part of these initial comments say that unfortunately Jacobs contributed to the image that was developed over the course of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into today, that public housing and housing of a certain kind for a certain kind of person is bad density. And then in contrast, the kind of density she spoke of with sort of more romantically, but I mean, again, this is where my own experience comes to play. It's not to say there's a lot of wonderful parts of the West Village then and now. But anyway, that was contrasted with a certain kind of good density that often was for and by white people of certain means. And that's a very reductive way to lay it out. And there's all sorts of exceptions. And she was about many more things than just that. And she would contest that then, I'm sure. But just to put it out there as a provocation that density wasn't one thing then, and it's certainly not one thing now. And when we talk about it, I think what comes to mind is different for different people and different places. And Jacobs had a lot to do with how some of those imaginaries have been developed over the last 60 years.
Well, and that brings me to the question that has been bothering me in relation to Jane Jacobs for the longest time. Well, first of all, I ask my students this question when we read Jane Jacobs in our theory course. I usually ask them, so was she right about everything? Or did she get something wrong? Another question really is, she addressed class a lot in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, but I personally don't remember her ever speaking to race and ethnicity in The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And that's clearly something that's been coming up more and more in conversations about rights to the city, about urban policing, about race-based police violence and brutality in American cities. And I wonder how would that fit into the entire curve of Jane Jacobs' arguments. Do you all, our panelists, do you all have an opinion on how we could perhaps incorporate this recent conversation, newer conversation that should have, of course, it should have started long ago, but unfortunately it only started several years ago. How do we incorporate this conversation into the system of arguments that Jane Jacobs formulated in The Death and Life?
I'll start, and I know this isn't going to be the end or answer here, but because I'm really interested to see whether people's perspective on this, because it's very difficult, and I appreciate you including this, Kate, in the topic of discussion, because it's very relevant today. And so, first of all, to Jacob's comment about how it sort of influenced time. And I think you're absolutely right. I think there's been a lot of reading and misreading of Jane Jacobs throughout the years, and the idea of Saint Jane as a sort of Jane Jacobs said it, therefore it must be true. I think it comes from a lot of people who pick on these things of, well, she said it should be like this, so therefore it must be right, versus I think what she was saying is we see the city in this way and we should observe it in this way and make conclusions based on that context. And I think that in a large parts led to um, and to your first question, one of the notes I had about, I think it's been more influential in the development of suburbs than urban space because of how it's been taken and created these spaces for affluent America based on those ideals versus not really what she was writing about in 1960s. I had the just by luck, I was living in Portland when Dark Age Ahead came out, her last book, which very prophetic for today. So I would recommend it as a read. And I went to the book signing at Powell's bookstore. I of course got up with my book and asked her to sign it, and I couldn't say anything but I love you so much, you know, to someone who's a sort of almost a hero to a lot of us. But in that discussion, there was a gentleman who asked the question. This is Portland, this great urban space of what are we going to do with all these people that are trying to move here, and how do we keep them out? And this quiet little lady with a crocheted trumpet for an earpiece to help her hear, who's with a walker, very unassuming, sort of turns into this sort of aggressive commentary and just tears him apart on we cannot, exclude anyone from this discussion of urban space. And if we do that, we lose our humanity. And I think that's how I hope, in her context, if it was a subject at the time, she would include related to the discussion. But I believe density is at the heart of that, as I agree with the gentleman, but I think it's diversity that becomes the more responsive question that has to go hand in hand with that. And she speaks a lot about diversity through the book, not always in racial diversity, but I think if you expand that term, and so I think from that standpoint, I would hope, or at least I perceive the way Jane Jacobs would think about it is not as an expert in any way, shape, or form, but being able to, if we limit that diversity within our communities, we really limit our own humanity and who we are, and forcing people to understand that difference. Just like she was writing then on understanding things we don't see, and I think most people don't accept that lack of diversity, even though it's blindingly staring us in the face. And I think people like Malcolm Gladwell today have sort of picked up that mantle in writing literature, basically from this investigative journal style, which she wrote so successfully, and turning our attention to things which we don't, that are in our face, but we don't see every day. So there's my sort of 2 cents on that subject and my one story about meeting Jane Jacobs.
I could jump in. I mean, I want that earpiece. Well, I guess it was a functional earpiece, right? If I just want to, like, as a hairpiece or something, that sounds amazing. Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that I hope my comments, I didn't know Jane Jacobs. I've never met her. Certainly would never want to impute motives or anything like that. The work we've been involved in is really just about contextualizing what her contribution has to discourse then has been a part of since then, basically. So I think you're absolutely right that density and diversity go hand in hand, and that in her writing, as with many other writers at the time, tended to focus on some things at the exclusion of other things, often race. So I guess I agree with that, and I would just say though that nonetheless the conversation that Death and Life sort of kicked off in some ways, certainly popularized amongst certain circles, and that really gained momentum, that conversation across the 60s and 70s. That had everything to do with the way that people thought about public housing all across this country, not just public housing in New York City, but even perhaps more importantly in other places, because New York City is one of the only places in the country where by the 90s, the public housing hadn't been completely demolished. And so, of course, I'm not putting this on the table to say that that is Jane Jacobs' fault by any means, but if you trace back, and this is what we tried to do a little bit modestly in this Unbroken Windows project, you can trace back some of the dots that are connected. So you go from Jane Jacobs to someone like, I don't know if you're in your class, you guys are reading Oscar Newman, Kate, but to this idea of defensible space, those are very much connected from 60s to 70s. There you go. And then you can track that right into the 80s and 90s and projects like Hope 6 that take many of the ideas that were romanticized, often rightly, I mean, are written about in a very positive way by Jacobs, about the scale of the block, mixed use, certain diversities of function, but also different types of people, as it were, living in close proximity. And then Hope 6, more or less, said, what we need to do is tear down all the housing blocks and replace them with things that look more like that. We could go in circles, I think, about the design merits of either one or the other, or some other thing entirely. But the important net result, I would argue, in that change is that in effectively every Hope 6 development that has come to be, many more apartments or houses are demolished than are ever built. So it's the opposite of what she was defending in your book signing. Maybe you're pushing people out of these places, and you're making room for people to come in, people of means, more or less. I mean, and again, that's not her proposal, but over the course of the last 40 years, as she was writing at a time where white flight was accelerating out of urban centers, and in some ways she was responding to that and trying to sort of refocus on the virtues of the city, I think, nobly. And it took some time, and a lot of other forces had to work their magic, but come 2004, white flight is very much running in reverse, and the suburbs are becoming the racially diverse places. I would say diverse in terms of class, but increasingly they're concentrations of people, of poorer people outside of cities, because that's where they can afford to live, often commuting into cities to work. So anyway, I could go on, but I think the image of the public housing that was there and then wasn't there is something that Jacobs directly spoke about. And though, again, I know she didn't write, and I would imagine didn't want any of those people to be forced out, the conversation that she contributed to, in a lot of ways, really gave momentum to, that was one of its big results. So I think as we, assess her work, and this is not something we're unique in doing, of course, it's really important to bring that back in and ask how some of the virtues she extols might be differently designed at different scales, because it has to exist not just at the scale of the block. As we know, many of today's problems that like climate change or inequalities of various kinds that were well underway by the 60s and 70s, they require solutions that operate at something larger than the scale of the block. So we have to, as a discipline, we need to sort of take that on, whether or not that's comfortable.
Jason, I just may say I agree with you completely, Jacob, in that I was trying to point that I felt there was an irony of her at the time trying to point out something that was wrong, and then the same things that she tries to point out are then flipped on its end in the process. So I completely agree with that assessment, and I just find it sort of ironic, in what she was doing was then taken as a doctrine, as its own way. And I think in retrospect, she herself probably, and I don't obviously personally know her, but as someone who was looking at observations, would make the same comment.
Right.
I agree with everything that Jacob and Corey have said. So the only thing I would add is I've been thinking about this. Where is race in the death and life of great American cities? And I think sometimes it's important to back up when you read a classic text and really understand the language being used at the time. And the doctrine that was sort of bandied about at the time was separate but equal, right? This idea that we could all have We could all live in our own little neighborhoods, white people here, African Americans there, and we could go to school in separate facilities. And as long as there was equal federal funding, somehow we had equal opportunities and equal lives. And so knowing that that phrase was sort of so poignant at the time, it's important, like when you look at late in the book, she says, separate but equal makes nothing but trouble. I mean, that if you can't read that any other way than a pretty strong kind of attack on racial policy. And so your question, Kate, about what do we do with the death and life, and how can we use it in terms of thinking about race? I think if we try to extract some lessons from Jane, she says she's interested in planners acting in ways they can actually have some authority. Architects, we far too often imagine that we're going to solve the world's problems through some sort of metaphor. And, she suggests that one of the things that planners at the time could look at was redlining. How do we get involved in sort of diminishing redlining? And just anecdotally, I did a project a couple of years ago where students had to make some films based on the book. And the student who was assigned that chapter went and interviewed mortgage loan lenders, mortgage loan officers in Jackson. And the first person she interviewed said, well, redlining was bad, but we don't do that anymore. And then the next person she interviewed said, not only do we not do it now, we never did it. It never existed. And so, I think keeping our eye on the ball in terms of realizing that there are policies that are still segregating our communities that planners and architects could either have a direct voice in or at least have influence in is maybe for me, the thing that comes out of the book that we should mind.
Thank you all. This is definitely fantastic commentary. So not only do we have to read carefully with an understanding of the thinking back in the day, but we also have to look into the effects that the text has produced over the years. How do you use Jane Jacobs in your own research or teaching? Do you? What do you do with Jane Jacobs' texts in your own practice?
I mean, maybe I'll just take this opportunity to very crassly plug more directly the Unbroken Windows thing. I didn't know if, how appropriate that would be, but we've been doing this project for maybe about a year now with the Queens Museum here in New York. And is it possible for me to just really quickly share my screen? Maybe not. Well, it's okay. You can just look if anybody wants to look. It's unbrokenwindows.queensmuseum.org. And I won't waste a whole bunch of time, giving a big tour of it. But the effort there has been to do precisely what I was trying to say before, which is to on the specific topic of broken windows policing, which we could, it's kind of another conversation a little bit, but basically cultures of policing and surveillance, to think about the spatial cultures of those things and to understand kind of exactly what Jason was saying, like what the role of our shared disciplines has been in those, can continue to be. And Jacobs has come into that. Maybe let me just show you really fast. Oh, I have to do a whole settings thing. I think it's on my side. It's all right. You guys can poke around. That's probably, if anybody wants to, that's probably a better way to do it anyway. To put her in context, sorry, it's just the long and short of it is to say, okay, we've got something like Jacobs in the 60s. We were focusing on broken windows. So the focus of basically we collected a whole bunch of primary sources that have some bearing on what is known as broken windows, which I guess maybe I can just say is the theory basically that that if one broken window is left unbroken in a neighborhood, it's kind of a metaphor and a real thing that they used, the original theorists. If it's left unbroken, very quickly, many more windows will be broken and a much more serious crime will follow. It's kind of like the slippery slope theory of policing. So in order to avoid those worst outcomes, what is necessary, according to the people who adhere to this theory, is increased surveillance, really intense, aggressive crackdowns on minor infractions. So in New York, the famous example was like arresting the guys who washed your car windshield, and came up at a red light and would wash your squeegee men. Came to be called really derisively. Anyway, so that became a theory of policing that in many ways persists to today. It's what existed behind what became known as stop and frisk. It informs all sorts of issues of policing, not just in big cities, but in many cities across the country. And so we were just trying to track through primary sources what the spatial cultures of this thing were, and where we as designers of various kinds, planners, might fit into this. Were we experts, kind of like Jacobs and Newman at the time? Were we sort of citizen activists, also kind of like Jacobs? I mean, there's music that's in here, there's movies, there's politicians play a big role, there's people who are writing legislation play a big role. So basically, this is again a specific line that is not, Jacobs wrote about many more things, but this is one way to sort of think about her like eyes on the street idea, and track it from the 60s up until well, the present day, depending on how you want to do it. So it was kind of a research and art project together with the museum. They're going to do some programming around it. We have a group of students that worked with us here for a while collecting these sources, and it was a real creative exercise to try and basically, connect this to that. So it has been proven really illuminating for us. Yeah, and so that's how Jacobs has been operating around here of late, studying her in context, and then also kind of understanding a more recent context in which she could be understood.
Just a brief note for our students, you have access to a link to the Unbroken Windows in the invitation that you all received. So please get back to that invitation and look the project up.
And I should also say we tried to set it up so that if anybody has ideas about things that ought to be added to this archive, there's a form you can fill out and we can invite you, and it's meant to be an open invitation, because this is obviously the kind of thing that can just go and go and go. So please do, on the info page, you can see more details about that.
Jason, so I'll go ahead and I'll take the next. You take the next one first. First of all, I think it's, as I said, it was hugely influential in when I read it. But I think it's important for me to share the context of that when I read it. And I was visiting my fiance's family in Warsaw, in Eastern Europe, in a 6-story housing block building on winter break, and looking out the window and said, "Hey, this works pretty well here." So what's going on? And I think that's exactly to the point of what we've been chatting about, is context matters incredibly in reading Jane Jacobs at the time, but also, and again, I really feel in the way that I've learned in sort of approaching problems. It's really, that's what I've taken away with the most, is seeing and observing. I think is the thing that I try to share with students. And I think the sense of, at the end, the greatest lesson that we can share with our students is the thing that I think she basically slapped in the face of every designer at the time, a sense of humility of, we, don't have it all figured out. And I think that and again, that ability to read the book literally in a landscape of public housing that's the exact same urban form as the public housing projects which were being talked about in the book at the time. And again, I completely agree, it led to all sorts of outcomes, negative, especially the public housing across the country. But again, it was that if you read that book and the only example you ever saw was Eastern Europe in the late 90s, say, well, isn't that where everybody lives and it works fine? And I think it's that, you know, we basically use the poor as this experiment, right, in modernist housing blocks. And that was, and obviously that was the root of many of the issues, this lack of diversity. But anyway, I think the bigger context, and not to go into that rabbit hole again, but the bigger context of that discussion in what we can share to our students out of this book is the humility that comes with that discussion of not knowing that we have, especially these intricate social fabrics understood. And as we think about, and she arguing against the idea of cities are not, again, going back to that earlier discussion, cities aren't works of art. They are much more complex than that. And anyone who thinks, I think she said, any man that thinks otherwise is nothing. It's, you know, is ego at the same time, right? So I think she speaks very clearly to that. I think that's the lesson that can be shared with our students most out of reading Jane. And I want to add to that, to really understand the time, and I'm glad you brought up Oscar Newman, that happened at the same time. The Power Broker, the story of Robert Moses at the time, reading about the other, the City of Tomorrow, right? It's planning, Corbusier, just all of that background as context is critically important to understand. And then understanding how that played out in the next 50, 60 years before jumping into, and I think that's potentially the biggest problem with Jane Jacobs as a book today, is it's seen as this sort of unfair doctrine that's supposed to be applied, where in fact she was really writing about a very specific place in a very specific moment in time. And I think that's the lesson that really we could share and embrace of, we don't always, we never have it figured out. And the limits, and really the lesson she shared, which was harsh at the time, but what is the true limitations to urban planning? And what are our true limits that we have? And I think that was embraced by other designers moving forward, and others took it in a different direction. So I think that's the biggest lesson to share from a teaching standpoint. In research, I think I've used it in a way. I research urban stormwater policy, but sort of working at an intricate small scale, the diversity of solutions kind of plays out my own thinking. But I think it influences mainly in that sort of approach to looking and observing. So.
I would say that Jane Jacobs doesn't overtly show up in any research that I work on. She's sort of like that nagging voice that I hear every time I sort of read something else, however. I use Jane Jacobs, I have used Jane Jacobs a lot in when I taught a course called Theory of Urban Design. We would read a series, kind of all the expected essays, and alongside that, the students would be reading the entirety of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And for several semesters, the students had to literally use that book as the ground which they would sort of evaluate Jackson, Mississippi. And let me explain, much like the other panelists, I don't believe the book is telling us I don't think there's a lesson in the book that you just can transpose out of New York at the time she's writing this book and you say it's true everywhere for all times. But for me, education versus indoctrination is sort of rooted in giving students this translational gap that they have to cross. And so when we used the book in that class, the students would be assigned various chapters, and their challenge was translate this from the time it's being written to now, and transpose the lessons from great American cities to Jackson in particular. And so you have students going out in this local place and doing a series of interviews. And the first several years I did that, it took the form of writing. And the last time we did that, each student took a different chapter, and a handful of students were sort of the Uber coordinators and editors. And we made an 1.5-hour documentary that they called The Death and Life of a Mid-Sized American City. And while you would never want to watch it on Netflix or anywhere else, it was kind of a powerful way to get the students engaged in the problems here by making them aware of this sort of way of thinking about cities that Jane Jacobs had already established.
Thank you all so much. It's quite inspiring to hear that people are still using her, but using her critically. I'm certainly trying to do the same. I don't know if I was critical enough. I guess my theory students will have to get back to me about that. And I totally hate to wrap up this discussion, but we have to get to the Q&A. And I hope that we will have some questions from at least one of our audiences, since we have an actual live audience out there. We also have an audience here, and we have an audience on Facebook. Dwayne, do we have any questions?
So none have come in to me on paper, but if we have any questions here in the audience, feel free to relay it to me and I'll relay it to the group. Oh, we have. All right. So here's a question. I think, is this from you, Professor White? This is from Professor Aaron White. Are there forms of agency that architects / planners lost by relinquishing the utopian model? Yes, by the utopian model Jacobs taught us to be perhaps rightly suspicious of. Are there forms of agency that architects and planners lost by relinquishing the utopian model that Jacobs taught us to be perhaps rightly suspicious of?
I mean, good to hear from you, Professor White. I my instinct is yes. Now, lost is a strong word, but have been dissuaded from for decades, might be a more accurate way to paint it. But I think that, we've talked about a certain kind of humility that Jacobs asked us to approach our reading of cities and also our work, our interventions in cities with. And I think it sounds like everybody on the panel in many ways really appreciates that, learned from that. I certainly, did and do. But at the same time, the opposite of humility is sometimes required to get big projects off the ground. And we all know that big projects are often necessary, like ever more so as we watch, the COP in Glasgow unfold, and the Rittenhouse trial moves ahead. I mean, we're the problems are as big or bigger than they were in the 60s. And so I think that there's a kind of agency, in many ways more so in planning than in architecture, that used to be. Obviously, people like Moses were rightly taken off their pedestal discursively. There was a lot of really strong critique starting then, honestly, with people like Jacobs, but at least popularly, but that persisted certainly through the 70s and 80s, and the field of planning then started to focus, have a different tone, operate often more as a kind of outside in, an outside in kind of way, if that's fair to say, rather than, let's say, from the top down, like somebody like Moses had operated. But I don't know. I would personally I'd say it's time, and we're doing some work here at the Buell Center under the rubric of a project we're calling Green Reconstruction, where we're asking the question of what would it take for our shared disciplines to really take on some of these problems at scale, and with, dare I say, if not ego, at least a sense of the monumental responsibility that, obviously we don't shoulder that alone, quite the opposite. And that's one of the things we've learned in conversations like the one that Jacobs was helping get going. But yeah, I think that there's serious like, yeah, I'm trying to work in agency here. I mean, I think reclaiming of a certain kind of agency that is beginning to happen more, and that was made difficult by, again, not Jacobs directly exactly, but the conversations and the shifts in our shared disciplines that Death and Life and other things like it sort of affected. So yeah, not lost, but minimized for a while, and let's hope coming back in a better and informed way. I'm not calling for more Moseses again, obviously, but we do need government workers who take pride in their work with humility and know how to work collaboratively and on big, thorny problems. So
This is a particularly good question considering the infrastructure bill that is
Yeah.
heading to be realized, it looks like.
Yeah, I'll add to that. That's a great question, because so many of the great urban spaces we see were built by an autocrat, for lack of a better description. Baron Haussmann and Paris, right? These moves today that we romanticize about, that I could still see Edmund Bacon walking down the Champs-Elysees in the 1970s video and then walking right through the fountain, to reinforce this idea of this great axis. And it is difficult to say where do we begin and where do we end. I think her book led to positive things like Christopher Alexander's work in urban design, right? I think that becomes a positive outcome of thinking about design. I really am a big fan of, I've referenced this earlier, but Robert Cushman's book on urban utopias in the 20th century, who's at Michigan. And he kind of ends in that discussion of what is the future of and also in contrast to Jacob's discussion directly. Is the future Dubai? Is this grand vision in this, is it happening and we don't know it yet? Jacob's, I think, criticism also sort of, and he directly talks about this, so I want to make sure I reference it, that she assumes the city exists, right, in this discussion. The city that she criticizes is one that exists in real form, right? It isn't created yet. And I think to be critical of cities, a new city is never a great city. Cities require time, and she even talks about that. Cities require time and history before they become occupied. They have their own stories. They have their own lives. And that's one of the things I think are most difficult about the idea of creating new form. No matter what we do, it's going to be wrong for the first 50 to 100 years before the things that she was extolling really allow to happen. That doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt to do those things to create what new urban space might look like. And I think that becomes the conundrum of this discussion in some way. And I think it's a fabulous question because and again, you could point to if New York wasn't laid out as the iron grid, to move transportation from both sides of the river in the 200-foot by 800-foot block, what is New York? And so, I mean, that was a bold plan, right, to make that happen, and which came with a great deal of criticism, and not just that, a great deal of human cost in displacement of indigenous species along the way. Indigenous peoples in the northern part of the island. And so, that's the challenge, I think, in moving forward with what are our visions of future urban space, because the cities that exist today are not going to meet the demands of the future.
Jason, would you like to address the agency question?
Sure. I know we are actually at time now, but yeah, I would follow up on what Corey said in the sense that I think Jacobs doesn't advocate an abandoning of our agency. I think she radically questions our agency toward what. And I was going to try to put a plug somewhere in here for one particular chapter, visual order and its limitations and possibilities. I think that's sort of the chapter that architects in particular should read and reread, because basically she accuses us of replacing life with art. And we make, as Corey said at the beginning, we make dead things. And yeah, it is a fair diagnosis of so much of what happens in planning and architecture, or has happened for the last 40 years, 50 years. And I think that is where our agency lies. It's beginning to understand how do we use our agency effectively. And it is probably not in making more and more things that refer to us and are self-referential in that way. That's it.
Are you saying that postmodernists were wrong? I'm sorry.
I'm saying almost everything we make is wrong, but that's another discussion.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Unfortunately, we are at time. So what I'm going to suggest, if students happen to have any more questions, send them to me and I will relay them to our panelists if they don't mind. Thank you, everybody. This was, sorry, I think that was Dwayne from the audience. Nope. Well, yeah, I think we are at time. So thank you, everybody. It was great to see you and meet you in person or online in person. And I hope we can eventually do something similar again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to
Thank
sign
you.
off here. That was excellent.